Hello everyone, welcome to From Nowhere to Nothing, Ontological Oxymorons. I'm your host, Joel Bouchard, a doctoral student in psychology, and with me today is Mr. Norman Gayford, a professor of English and philosophy. If there's a topic you'd like us to cover on the show, feel free to email us at fromnowheretonothingpodcast@gmail.com or contact us on our Facebook page. Occasionally, we do entire episodes covering philosophers both past and present. Today, we'll talk about one of the veritable titans of contemporary philosophy as he passes from present philosopher to past one. Known for numerous brilliant contributions, which we'll skim the surface of today, he was also a memorable and to some an abrasive character. Join us in remembering the life and work of Daniel Dennett.
Fair point. Living in Maine helps that, I think, probably.
Yeah, it's funny. I've read and listened to some interviews recently, even before we were going to do this topic, and there's some things that I stick out where I go, oh wow, man, this is really something. And other times where I go, ooh, like that. He doesn't
pull punches.
No, he doesn't at all. So really interesting character. So who was Daniel Dennett?
As you said, a philosopher, a scientist, although he sort of disavowed the cognitive science part. Not really disavowed, but sort of. Remember we were talking about the farmer last week who was my father-in-law, but we were using a larger model with someone who does this intense work, but it's not really where he spends most of his time, and yet he defines himself that way. And I think I say this cautiously because I didn't know him, only through his books, but he's been a presence in my intellectual life and therefore my daily life, really for decades. And so, yeah, I've listened to him giving interviews and watched them on YouTube over the years and he can be spiky. I'm thinking, well, so can I. and so here's a man who spent a lot of time actively working at ideas that he openly expressed as counterintuitive. And people would say, Daniel, these ideas don't work. They're counterintuitive. Well, of course they're counterintuitive. That's what my intent is. And so he's that kind of person. I imagine he was that kind of teacher. I can only imagine all the decades of students that he had at Tufts as well as other places. What delightful, mind-bending, infuriating conversations they must have been.
Yeah, it was interesting hearing some of his, him just talking about, people say that I don't use I don't play by the rules of philosophy. I don't use the language of philosophy. He goes, of course I don't. It's broken. It doesn't make any, it doesn't work, Yeah. And I thought that's interesting, just because if you reflect on the history of human advancement, right, whether it's philosophical thought or scientific technology or whatever it is, and I can't remember if we talked about this on the show or if this was in an audiobook that I had been listening to, but basically the way that the history sort of pans out, right, is you have a paradigm by which, science and philosophical contemporary thought operate. And as the paradigm goes on, there's tweaks made to it as new information comes to light. But then there eventually comes a tipping point where you've made so many tweaks that the original paradigm is called into question, and then there's a new paradigm that rises up to challenge it and is constructed, and evidence is amalgamated for it, and eventually there's a changing of the guard, and then the whole process continues over again. Right?
Yeah.
And I think that Dennett was really one of those guys. He was the changing of the guard in some ways.
I think that's a good way of putting it. I mean, there are so many phrases in some specialized philosophy, but even in ordinary parlance now, that came from him. We did talk about memes once in relationship to, and brought Daniel Dennett into that because he originated the idea. And that's just one of dozens of things. He wrote close to 57 books. He was writing since his first book was published in 1969. When I was 11, and I wasn't reading Daniel Dennett because, but as with so many other things, I had people in college and grad school directing, suggesting, oh, here's somebody you might want to read. And I think that's one of the most important aspects of teaching. It's informal. It's not a lesson planned. With individual students, it might be lesson planned in one's mind, but mostly you're just being Johnny Bookseed and oh, here, I think you might like toss this. And I had people doing that all the way through my lifetime, still do. My oldest chronological, in years, friend is still tossing books at me, and we read plays that I've never read, and I'm learning. And we just, before the show started, talking about this idea of the cognitive health of people who age. And you've studied that, and I think that Dennett, who was in his 80s, any scholar who is out there working and still publishing books is worthy of note for having lasted. And not just lasted like it's some kind of, the winds and the rains are eroding me, but I'm still here. But as you said, as reset some paradigms and was unflinching in saying, nope, there's another way of looking at things.
Yeah.
And in each of his books, fresh ways of approaching that I just think are great.
Yeah. Yeah. So he was noted for, well, I guess that would be the next question I'll ask is just what kind of philosopher was Dennett? What were his areas of focus? What approaches did he take?
Well, he was a cognitive scientist, but in philosophy, and because he didn't, this was not a line drawer. Well, let's cross over. So cognitive science, but philosophy of mind. Because consciousness was always a thing in his writing, philosophy of science. So, as you might imagine, all the questions one asks about how science is done and how it might be done, and then more specifically, philosophy of biology. So we've got cognition, we've got mind, we've got science, we've got biology, and so when you're immersed and masterful in all of those things, new things emerge.
Yeah. So his sort of approach, I think that his career was, sort of defined by thinking about the human mind, in a lot of ways, and that is necessarily a multidisciplinary thing that you need to take a multidisciplinary approach to studying the human mind, right? Because he's a physicalist, right? So we've talked about in the past, that he believed that, a monist, right? The physical body is what there is. And, the different things that come from that philosophical stance, right? He was an atheist. He was a secularist, right? And so...
And he was a compatibilist because he was always concentrating on free will.
Yes. Free will was an interesting part of it. But if that's your approach and then you're trying to understand the human mind, then you have to go to biology, right? And he was known for his again, contrarian views on evolutionary psychology, right? And views on biology, and then consciousness and content, right? His dissertation, the view of trying to reframe first person accounts of consciousness in a third person empirical sort of framework. And so, so from beginning to end, right? If you decide to tackle the human mind, you decide to tackle consciousness, you're going to have to know about biology and psychology and philosophy and all kinds of other,
And being a physicalist means that you're going to insist on studying it and its capacity to be studied within the limitations of the physical apparatus the organic apparatus that we are. And so we've talked about these kind of things before, but here's somebody, first rate, beyond first rate, who's saying, yeah, it's all here. It's all in the package. And you don't, I'm not here to assert that you have to accept that. He was somebody who was all about debating, thinking, finding your way to the truth of that. And so it's not for me to sit there and say, oh, well, he was right. No, he's far beyond me as a thinker. But if you take his arguments as they are, they can be compelling.
Yeah, I think that, reflecting on him, I still come up with the same issues that I come up with any philosophical thinker and any philosophical school of thought, right? Which is, the language is, although there's the change in the language itself is still insufficient to express the ideas, right? And you still run into problems of categorization that cause you to not quite feel good about it. But that's the important part, right? If you're a monist and a physicalist, you're not going to take the easy way out. And I don't say that disparagingly, right? Because I'll be honest about it. I don't know whether monism or dualism is right. I don't know whether physicalism or, I don't know. But what I do know is that when you look at the different approaches, a monist and a physicalist faces a much greater uphill battle in establishing their thoughts and beliefs on a situation than somebody who can sort of say, okay, well, insert supernatural force or unknowable thing here in order to explain something, which is anti-scientific. And we've talked in the past that, science is not the be all end all. Science has a limitation to the things that it can study. But at the same time, it's the best tool we have. And we limit ourselves to a great extent if we rule out the possibility of science ever being able to answer a question, right? So many things in the past that were ruled out as being unable to be solved by science have been solved by science, right? So I think that's why philosophy is so hard, right? Is because you have to remain open-minded and you have to keep questions open-ended and be able to trust in processes that work, but that don't have the current tools or technology to succeed now. But it's
this attitude in one of the books that I didn't read. The books that I've read of his certainly weren't read in order, but it's called Breaking the Spell, Religion as a Natural Phenomenon. And what he says in that, and I think we'll go to some things that he actually wrote and said, because it's talking about what you're talking about. My faith in the expertise of physicists like Richard Feynman, who we've talked about, for instance, permits me to endorse, and if it comes to it, bet heavily on the truth of a proposition that I don't understand. So far, my faith is not unlike religious faith, but I am not in the slightest bit motivated to go to my death rather than recant the formulas of physics. Watch. E doesn't equal mc squared. It doesn't. I was lying. So there. But you see, it's that levity and that whimsy and that seriousness all at the same moment that I think what you hear when he's spiky and he's done to death with people approaching him and berating him about being an atheist. I mean, how I know that in my small way in this world, there are moments when I get very fatigued with living in the 21st century and saying, this is not where I belong. And I can only begin to imagine the frustration level of having written all of these things, having talked and worked and being involved with it because you're doing it all the way through your life, to have someone knock on your door or approach you and say, yeah, but what makes you an atheist? And how come you can't be a... And sometimes he would just refuse to take those things on after a while, because how many different ways can you say something and then say, if you're not paying attention, if you're not reading me,
right,
then I can't give you a fresh answer.
Yeah, if you're not going to put in the kind of work to understand the positions, then the conversation doesn't need to happen.
Here's another one that he says, I think we should stop treating the quote, God works in mysterious ways, as any kind of wisdom, and recognize it as a transparently defensive propaganda. A positive response might be, oh, good, I love a mystery. Let's see if we can solve this one too. Do you have any ideas? See, I've watched him again in videos and listened to him in interviews, and I can just see the twinkle. I can just see the,
yeah,
let's do this.
Yeah, and it was that was simultaneously charming to some people and abrasive to others, right? So yeah, we've done a good job talking about, a little bit about his life, but a lot about his approach. But he has so many ideas that we should really dive into some of them. So
yes.
Let's start with, what is heterophenomenology? What was his view of that?
Okay, so I'm digging out my notes here because I've got pages and pages that I'm not going to read on here word for word, because that would be just extremely dull for everybody. So first, phenomenology. What is it?
So it's experiencing, right?
Right. And the study of experiencing.
Mm-hmm.
All right. Heterophenomenology is of another, not oneself, third person that you mentioned before. So when you're talking about qualia, when you're talking about experiences, rather than self-reports, you're trying to back away and listen to those rather than what you yourself are experiencing.
Yeah, and so this is what we briefly alluded to earlier, but like to flesh out the idea, right? I've heard him talk critically about Descartes in interviews.
Yeah, it's about Cartesian phenomenology. Yes.
Right, because he says, what Descartes' main problem is that he isolated himself from everybody else. And when you do that, you're accepting yourself as the authority on what is true and what isn't. And when you do that, well, then any single person's truth is that to them. So it's almost solipsism in some ways, right?
Yeah.
Whereas, if you and he was an avowed disbeliever in qualia, right? This idea of the internal experience.
Yes.
And that rubs people the wrong way, because to us, that's the most subjectively real thing we have. But really, you don't need to go any farther than like dreams or psychedelic drugs or anything like that to realize that qualia can be things that may be real to you, but don't exist in the outside objective,
precisely,
empirically perceived reality.
And that's not an attack.
No,
it's not. It's just an observation. Which, if you consider how you see things, when you're feeling really low, if you're feeling under the weather, so to speak. Side note, that's one of the goofiest phrases I've ever heard, because we all are, except for a few people in the space stations and jets. Anyway, so I've just got his mood today, I think. So you're trying to do an intersubjective, empirical look at experience, the heterophenomenology, the experience of others. And I forget which book or essay it's in, but he talked more than once, I think, about the idea that even if you could put sensor devices in somebody's mind and try to get them to see what you're seeing, it wouldn't work. Because you could, if you reverse the sensors, if you turn the picture upside down, you get different colors, so the colors you see and the colors I see in very specific terms are not necessarily the same complex of hues and values in an artistic composition. Even today, there was a beautiful sunrise this morning. I was out photographing it. I was looking at what I saw, and what my photographs saw were not unlike. But of course, the photographic lens, 5 lenses on the phone, right, able to pick out things that I could not discern. But then one can also manipulate those things. One can add light or reduce contrast and how much exposure post-photograph. And that's wondrous for an artist. But it also more than adequately indicates to me the validity of what he says. Any number of things do, but just that is one example.
Yeah, and I thought he had an interesting quote that I read was him sort of kind of poo-pooing his own theory of hetero phenomenology by saying, listen, this isn't something that is unique or brilliantly insightful. He said, this is something that any honest researcher should do when trying to study human consciousness. It's just not accepting self-report and not conflating your own experiences with reality, and instead using a third-person objective empirical approach to examining how conscious experience works. He said that's just how science should be done.
That's how it should be done, and realizing at the same time that, as you were talking about earlier with the equipment we have marvelous equipment now, but we still can't do this as adequately as a cognitivist physicalist would want.
Yeah.
So it's not going to get there yet.
Yeah, and this idea of visual perception is really an encapsulation of the whole issue in a nutshell, right? Is this idea of, okay, well, if you had sensors in your brain, and it's interesting because they're coming up with these things now, where there's technology where you can imagine something that projects it onto a screen that I can then see.
Yes,
right?
yes, yeah.
But there's too many things, right? There's what you are seeing, and then there's the technology that is transferring that information, and then there's the media it's transferred to, and then there's my biological machinery that is reinterpreting it. There's too many levels of difference in between for there to be something that is identical. So I cannot experience what you're experiencing.
Right.
But at the same time, another thing Dennett railed against was postmodernism, right? This idea that there is no truth. It's all interpretation, right? No. If you imagine something and it pops up on that screen, I see it, I'm not seeing exactly what you're seeing. I'm not experiencing
what you're experiencing.
But there is something there that we are both seeing and we are both interpreting through a lens. And therefore, there is an objective thing that is happening, right? And so I do like that visualization, because that sort of is the crux of a lot of the philosophical ideas that he was wrangling.
Absolutely. He was wrangling with those things. And something just occurs to me, because I was listening to John Oliver this week. I love John Oliver. He just cuts to the chase, and marvelous comedy, but also facts. And he was talking about UFOs. And if there were any topic, were there any other topic? I mean, just imagine when we say UFO, what do we mean by UFO? Well, it's an unidentified flying object. Many of us see UFOs. Mm-hmm. Oh, but that's not what we mean, right? Carl Sagan was one of the people who was outspoken and said, bring me evidence of alien life, and I will believe alien life. And so he's in Dennett's spot, but I don't disbelieve that you've seen something. but how do we get to what it was that you've seen, and what must we take into account in order to do that? And there's just marvelous. I mean, I read every book on UFOs I could from the time the earliest I remember was 10. Still do, and the explanations of what so much of it is, up to the point that can be explained, well, they're kind of dull compared to what you would want, but they're also understandably believable from all kinds of cognitive viewpoints. And so, okay, so factually, empirically, here's likely what was going on, or can be actually pinned down absolutely. Which doesn't mean everything can be explained, and trained pilots were seeing things, but we could watch the same thing out a window and say, "Oh, do you see that? Oh, what are you seeing? Well, there's something moving over above it. Well, yeah, it's moving kind of like a bird. No, I haven't seen a bird move like that." And that in informal terms is what Dennett is talking about.
Yeah. Yeah, so that seems like a good segue into the next question, which was, or the next concept, belief in belief, right? You talked about.
This is the one that I think got him frequently into trouble. When he's talking about belief in belief, he's really zeroing in on a kind of Mulderish, as in Mulder and Scully X-Files, but really a Mulderish, a messy approach to religion. Belief in belief essentially is a kind of reductivism that's okay, and an obscurantism for him. That all religions believe something. All of them have equal validity, but they're not necessarily applicable to one person as opposed to another. It's all messy, right? I believe that we believe. How far back can you go with that? What hall of mirrors is it? So do you believe in the belief, or do you believe in the thing itself? But how do you believe in the thing itself when you've never experienced it? And then how do you convince yourself that you have experienced it? And by saying the word convince, I am not attacking the same, but what has led you? I have, through my life, had deeply religious people in my life. The ones that I honor are the ones who believe, but not so much that they aren't able to question what they believe, because that leads to deeper insight, I think, about philosophically about life. But the people who just accept belief and won't question what that belief is about is what Dennett was talking about.
Yeah. It's it was an interesting.
I mean, what did you were you having issues with it?
No. I've read a couple different things about the way that he had thought about it, and I thought it was interesting. I think, and I heard him talk about it in another interview. He said he thought of religion as being a nurse crop, this sort of thing where, okay, before you can plant hay, you have to plant oats, because the oats have woodier stems.
Yeah.
So they, if you just plant hay, the wind will just blow it over and the rain will blow it down. It's too fragile. So you have to plant something that can guide the hay to grow. So the hay is science and secularism and the advances in technology and thinking that have led to modernity, right? And religion is that thing that has sort of structured the ability for that growth to happen.
Yeah.
And what he meant by that, right, is that, at the dawn of civilization, because again, we have to remember that Dennett was always thinking about this from an evolutionary psychology framework, right?
Yep, across the...
So in the beginning of human civilization, human interaction, when people were just starting to work together, you needed a guiding principle that would keep them united, and that was present in morality, essentially, right? If you need a code of morality, otherwise the biggest, strongest, brutish tribe, individual, what have you, is going to rule, right? And you can look in the animal kingdom and see, well, none of those species have tribes beyond a dozen members. None of them are building skyscrapers or sending things to space, right? So you have to have something that allows for a civilization to develop, and that was how he sort of envisioned religion's contribution to the advancement of the human civilization, was the institution of some sort of archaic but universal moral code, right? There's these principles that everybody believes in, that religions across the world sort of share. And yes, all of the details and all of the added on stuff gets messy and detrimental, but at their core, there are things that talk about, not killing each other and not taking each other's property and trying to live a good life, right? And that was sort of how he envisioned things should play out versus just, like you were saying, believing in belief.
Right. It goes hand in hand with, I think, what he was talking about with consciousness. In evolutionary terms, humanity, the human beings develop the competence of survival. But you don't need consciousness to do that, he said. And when consciousness is finally developed through language and through, he has another term that I love that we had bring up, it's called informavores. He said humans are informavores. We just gobble up knowledge to try to situate ourselves, to try to contextualize ourselves. But when you're doing that, you're not just being competent at surviving anymore. And so rather like, this is an old-fashioned technology now, but the Saturn V rocket that I grew up with watching and being in awe of, we have first stage, second stage, third stage. First stage, it just drops backward, falls into the ocean, gets picked up. Okay, it's trash. It doesn't work anymore. Second stage, okay, falls back. And then finally the capsule gets elevated, accelerated outer space. Well, it's human evolution too. The first stage becomes not useful anymore. Second stage becomes not useful anymore. I think it's not oversimplifying too much to say that there was no use for religion anymore.
Yeah, it's interesting. And there's still work being done. There was a study that came out, I think about a year ago now, looking at human DNA, and they found that, the parts of the DNA that were responsible for core, critical human functioning were repaired at almost perfect rates, right? Were repaired all with great precision. But then aspects on the fringes weren't repaired as well. And so the interpretation of the scientists who did the study was that, the DNA, like how evolution unfolds, is aspects that are critical to survival of the human functioning, right? Your body takes good care to make sure that those work. But all the stuff that's not critical for human functioning, like, it's a little bit up for debate. Like, we're going to let some variance trickle in there and then see how it plays out. Maybe it'll be adaptive. Maybe it will kill us off. But if you average it out over the population of all humans, there's going to be a protection of the core entity of what it is to be a human. But then there's going to be this development that happens over the course of generations. So it's...
See, and you put me, that often puts me in mind of literature, because this is the humanities person here talking, right? But he was obviously well read, and it doesn't matter the specifics of it. But I think of Dune, the book Dune, but the movie has picked up on this a little bit too. The book better. It's about the wheat and the oats. It's about planting a religious system that plants for over generations, plans and prophecies and stories that will grow and develop and twist and turn, that can be useful. And this is where it differs to the overall empire of essentially an economic-based empire that I think of when I think of that explanation about Dennett and about comprehension and about the difference between just competence and getting beyond competence.
Yeah. So Dennett, we've talked about memes a little bit. Dennett spoke about memes long before the internet came around. So I couldn't tell if it was Dennett or Dawkins that invented the term, but Dennett definitely was one that
Dennett developed it. I shouldn't have said invented. I think it was I think that's one of those osmotic
I think
things.
They were obviously they had a lot of communication and interaction together, and were defending a lot of the same principles.
Yeah, but Dennett ran with it. And so the idea of the meme is the replicable particulate matter of mind that allows us to push and push and push and learn things. In other words, language. Language is meme. Language constructs constantly evolve. Some hang on, some don't. Some are embraced, some are tossed away, but then things keep coming back. So it's not the meme that people use necessarily on Instagram or Reels or whatever, but the memic idea of the replicable thing that just stays in the mind. The earworm, I think, was related to that. It's really language.
Yeah.
The language of the visual in what's currently called meme, but still language.
Yeah, and I don't think that he ever went this far because of, his empirical outlook, but I remember seeing a quote from him where he sort of insinuated, right, that might be at the root of consciousness, this idea that, when you look at the brain, neuroscientifically, and you see the distributed nature of how processes work and how electricity and chemicals flow through, and how you can see the evolutionary structure of the brain, right, starting with the hindbrain, at the brainstem and the cerebellum, and moving outward, and how information passes through it. He goes, you can imagine how a narrative structure developed in the brain, right? And I don't know if he developed it further than that, but to me, that sort of sounded as if there might have been a suspicion that narrative structure that formed out of the development of the brain over the course of human ontology, right, was related to our perception of our lives as being a narrative, right? Something that is a continuous sort of...
He did develop that, and I think that counter to what some people said about that, and trying to, in their own reductivist ways, trying to just throw it out, he was not throwing out narratives. When he said that the haven all memes depend on reaching is the human mind, but a human mind is itself an artifact created when memes restructure a human brain. Mind and brain are different. We've talked about this too. All right, so restructure a human brain in order to make it a better habitat for memes. Language restructures brain. Language is stories. Stories and narrative restructure the brain so that more stories and narratives can be developed, so the perceptions change. When people say, well, the computers are rewiring our brains, that's not far off.
No, it's interesting, right? Because it's almost as if it's a cognitive parasite in a way, right? And I don't mean to use parasite in necessarily a disparaging term, but like you and I have talked on the show several times about how there's a possibility that most of the cells in a human body are not human at all, but actually are bacteria, right? There's a good chance that by weight, you are more other animals than you are you, right? Well, if you take that to the, I would say non-physical realm, right? But that's just my natural language. Obviously, Dennett would not view it this way, but to the cognitive realm, right? And you think about memes as being these things that insert themselves into how we function cognitively. And then by strengthening those neural pathways and developing new parts of the brain, right? And strengthening those connections. Well, what happens when you strengthen those connections? It makes it easier for you to accept those memes in. And those memes start to shape the way that you view the world, the way that you perceive reality, right?
They do.
And so your whole consciousness is developed and is based off of, years, decades, centuries, millennia of the strengthening of these neural pathways of narrative, right? Of seeing and experiencing the world as being one continuous story with us as a central character. But
this is a nexus point that leads out to other things that he was talking about. So if the brain changes, so if the mind and the illusion of consciousness takes place, that illusion will keep transforming. The questions that one asks will keep transforming. But he also talks about the not singular location of consciousness in the mind. So that you've mentioned this before from your studies. So an experience can be processed different ways in different parts of the brain. So that experience is multi-interpretable, multi-locus, being processed in multimodal ways. So, of course, it's not just one experience.
Yeah. And the implications of that are beyond what we can imagine, but I think it does lead back to narrative, right? Because if you have, like when we looked at in our video episode, right, the one psychologist that was talking about how there's no hard drive for the brain, right? Where do we store the information? And there was no answer to that, but even looking at the processing, the distribution of the processing, right? Okay, you have visual stuff in one area and auditory stuff in another area and another area associated with meaning and these sorts of things. And you need them all and your hippocampus in order to redraw a memory out and conceive of it. That distributed, aspect of the brain, there's no centralized place where it's taking place. The whole thing is consciousness, and consciousness has various aspects to it. And you can see it played out in the rare cases of people with very specific brain injuries, right? The man who mistook his wife for a hat, right, is a good example, right? How do you
look that one up if you haven't?
Yeah, it's fascinating, and you'd think it's science fiction if it wasn't a scientifically observed phenomenon. But yeah, it is a great nexus point, and I think that it kind of leads us into his cassette theory of dreams, right? Do you want to kind of explain that?
Well, because I come from the generation that had cassettes, I'm happy to help take that one on. Basically, it's related to what we just talked about. All of the dreams, the half dreams, the little wisps, the vignettes that we experience. Essentially, to use that metaphor of the cassette, the memory picks those things, edits them, and puts them on a tape. Oh, I know, that's so old-fashioned. Well, that's updated. Puts it on a DVD. Nope, still too old-fashioned. Puts it on a reel and lets you click on it, or in the old days, insert the tape and play it. Because the mind has sorted out and edited the things that we want to see. Or if not want, because some dreams are pretty horrific. The best part, it's the director's cut. Who's the director? Well, there's the other question. So that's rough, but there it is. So it's accessible and it's reaccessible. You can put the tape back in.
Yeah, and this even expanded, I think, in later years to the conscious experience of a whole, and this has been borne out in science. And we've talked about some of the studies that have looked at this, where, Dennett remarked in one piece that perception there's a constant editorial revision happening, right? And basically, what we've talked about this in the past, it sort of is reduced to a smoothing out, right, of reality. There's so much information around us at all times that our limited, cognitive capacity would be overwhelmed by all of the information if we were unable to filter it. And this is something that happens in more severe cases of autism, right, where synapse pruning fails to happen, and so you have a significant number of neural connections, and rather than having certain high-speed myelinated pathways that are that make things efficient and help us focus and sort of bring things into a cohesive whole, you just bombarded by information, and it's too much to take in, right? It's too much to function with. And so this constant editorial revision, right? This connects back to that concept of memes in some way as well, right? This memic thing, it didn't just result in the modern human brain through millions of years of evolution, right? It happens over the lifespan of a human being as well, based off of our environmental stimuli. So day in and day out, we experience things, and our brains are shaped to perceive reality based off of those prior experiences. And so the dreams are part of that as well, right? Like you were saying, regardless of want, it's what your brain thinks that you need to see, right? It's the things that it's sort of deeming are most important based off of
or things we might want to see. I mean, he has this phrase. I love this phrase. It sounds like Louis Borges writing, who writes his wonderful fantasy tale about the library, but he calls it the Library of Undreamed Dreams. And that's what goes on the cassette. So what you might need to experience, we replay that. But when we replay a dream, we transform that dream. We change that dream. We have a particularly vivid dream. We do not remember all of the details, most of us. And we shape it. And we call that lucid dreaming. Or we get it and we're in a dream, but then we revise the dream as we go. To my knowledge, he didn't write specifically about lucid dreams, but I may be wrong because I haven't read all of his books. But the idea that that memory, the cassette, what's on it, will respond to stimuli of various kinds. It makes new dreams out of the original rough material. It begins to sound a little like the collective unconscious back to Jung, just a little. It also sounds a little like virtual reality, just a little. But this is probably what tells me, he's really onto something here. And people get all hung up in the technology. Well, you know what? I have an audio cassette player. I still have a Walkman. I listen to LP albums that were made before Walmart started regenerating LP albums. I have videotapes, DVDs, and streaming. And are all of them equally good at equal moments? No. Sometimes I want to hear a scratchy record. But just take that as an example of the memory cassette. Suppose there's a tune that's playing. Do we alter tunes in our head when we hear them?
Yeah, I think that my favorite example is you can go online on forums and find lyrics of songs that people have misheard and what their interpretations of them were. And it's funny to see, right? Because everybody, I've been singing along to this song for 20 years and I thought that were the words, but it's not, right?
And I'm going down a path that there is a point to this, but I'm going to ask you as a musician. So what's the definition of a cover?
I think the cover, a cover is just when somebody is playing a song that was written by somebody else.
Because I think about the word cover. What does that imply?
Sort of the front facing or the thing that wraps something else.
Okay. So it's not the thing in itself.
No.
But it is
the overlay, I guess.
An overlay. Okay. I'm thinking of this marvelous piece. I've forgotten the musician that did this with you, that you did on Sunshine on My Shoulders.
Yeah. Yep.
Marvelous. John Denver didn't do it that way, but it's a marvelous cover. To me, it's more than a cover because it's a transformation, but it's recognizable. It's a meme in my mind. Sunshine on My Shoulders, because I associate all kinds of memories with it. But hearing that new one made me it took me back to some memories I associate with that song and changed the way I saw those memories. So what's this all about? This is all about, to me, this library of undreamed dreams that gets put onto and transformed. This is not a static process, and it is very much creative, and so it's a testament to what the mind does, or what the brain does in making mind.
Yeah, and that song came out of a dream, because I had dreamed that Jack Johnson and Norah Jones were doing a cover of Sunshine on My Shoulders at a concert that I was at, and then I woke up and thought, man, that would be so cool if they did that, but they're never gonna. So I'm going to try to do my best version. I'm going to cover their cover, which was in a dream of a real song, and yeah, where does that come from? Right. It's that mimic thing, right? I've heard Jack Johnson's music. I've heard Norah Jones' music. I've heard the song Sunshine on My Shoulders. And somewhere in my dreams, it threw it all on the cassette, right? It said, this seems like something that would be cool or relevant or meaningful to you. And it played out in reality.
And so I'm not trivializing by bringing this stuff up. I'm not trivializing or what Dennett was talking about. I think it's, to me, it's some kind of evidentiary, if not empirical, anecdotal, qualia that points to it.
Yeah. So I think that we should sum up by talking about the brain and the vat, which we've talked about quite a bit, but I feel like that's the culminating part to this discussion.
Yes. So where are you at if your brain is in a vat? Don't worry, I'm not going to do any more with that. But I think that's the essential question. So the thought experiment, the intuition pump, which you would call it, was a thought experiment, is that someone's brain is removed, encased, put in a vat, floating along. It's a Marvel Comics kind of thing, if you think about it. And the body's somewhere else. So where are you? Are you the floating brain? Are you not that body at all, that's somewhere else?
Yeah. This is, I think that I've thought about this question quite a bit recently, and I think that this is one that's in need of a reinterpretation, I think, based off of modern evidence. And I don't know what it is because I'm not a great philosopher, right? But just things that make me go, about it, right?
Yeah.
The first one is, this idea that you could stimulate certain sections of the brain associated with perception and you'd get perception, I think is false, because you don't have the neural pathways for that perception to take place. We're getting evidence that suggests that a lot of thinking is done in your body. And I don't mean that in a more exaggerated way than what I'm stating, but what they found is that you have your spinal cord, right, has the ability to remember and learn information, right? You have nerves throughout your body. And so you yourself are a holistic thing, right? And so when you remove pieces, things get very tricky. And another aspect of this is phantom limb syndrome, right? If you lose an arm, right, you still think that arm is there. And as a matter of fact, some people experience extreme pain in the limb. And for a long time, cognitive scientists weren't sure what was happening there. What they are starting to understand, and so this is new science, so it's stuff that is still under the microscope, we might say, but what's happening when you're experiencing that extreme pain in this limb that no longer exists is actually the part of your brain that was mapped to that limb, which we call your motor homunculus, is using the space that had been allotted to that limb to learn and map new areas of your body. And so that manifests as pain because it's nerves firing. They're making new connections, forming new signals, but the old signals to the phantom limb are still there, and it's registered as pain, right? So, and there's even some evidence that this occurs when we lose a loved one, right? If somebody dies, right? They're not physically us, but we've incorporated the meme, right, of their being into us so much that when they die, we still perceive them as there. And we don't, and that is something that sort of, in a monist physicalist way, explains the superstitious way that we feel about loved ones still being there after they're dead, right? And some people would say, well, I don't know about that. Like, how do you figure that out from the human brain? Well, it's pretty easy, right? There's a study that, you can do an experiment at home, right? If you hide your left arm with a blanket so you can't see it, then you put a fake rubber hand coming out from under the blanket, and then you have a friend and he strokes your hand and the rubber hand with a feather the same way and touches them with a finger the same way. And then, whenever he decides is the right time, stops touching your hand and only starts touching the rubber hand, your brain will tell you that the rubber hand is your hand, right? So your brain can accept, and they've even done this with things as unhuman as tables and chairs and stuff. They've incorporated random objects in the environment into the brain schema of what we are as a person, right? So we can do this with things that are not us. We can think of them as being part of us. When parts of us are no longer there, our brain can tell us that they are there and that the things are happening. So when you take the brain out of the body, right? Even if you were firing signals into that disembodied brain, I don't know that you would get anything that would approximate human consciousness. And I think the visual system is a great example of it too, right? There's an enormous amount of visual processing that happens at the level of the retina, at the level of V1, at the level of the prefrontal cortex. It's a systematized, non-central distributed process that amalgamates into vision and our perception of the world. Okay. And so if you cut out any of those processes, I don't think that you land at what is human experience, right?
Well, all right. So what you've just done wonderfully is indicate when an intuition pump might not be useful in its original iteration anymore. And Dennett would say that. I don't know if Dennett would say that about the vat or not, but remembering that comes from decades.
Right.
Past,
yeah.
And he would often say, well, it's time to, when something doesn't work anymore, try something else.
Mm-hmm.
I'm paraphrasing, but I said, okay, so how would you alter that? You wouldn't need to have the brain in the vat to decide where consciousness is. That's what you're saying, right? You don't need to be that dramatic.
Yeah.
Because you might not have, because without I think what you're saying is, in a very physicalist way, if you don't have eyes, now we're like 1950s pulp magazines. Is it a brain with eyes that are floating out there? No. Okay. No mouth, no eyes, no ears. It's just in the vat. How, if anything were happening, it would be because of where the brain had been with all the ocular and oral devices before it got put in the vat, right?
Yeah.
So would it see, or would that, in the sense of physical? No. Would the brain be able to see?
Yeah, I think we can still ask interesting questions, right? And I think that's the big one is memory, right? Because as far as we know, like what I said earlier about the spine being able to learn and form memories, most of that has to do with the reflexes, right? So not things that we are consciously aware of. Mm-hmm. But the brain, from what we can tell, most of memory recall is isolated to the brain. So perceiving new things, right? Being able to be a brain in the vat and say, oh, I see a beautiful sunset, right? That wouldn't happen because the visual information in the eye and in the optic nerve and all that stuff that happens before it reaches the brain is no longer there. But like we were talking about before, when we remember things and we are able to summon a visual image, it's not as detailed as seeing, and it's malleable, but it still seems real to us in some way. Would that still be available to the brain? I can't see why not, And so, yeah, I think that the brain, the vat, as an intuition pump, it still works, but I think that...
But for different questions.
Yes. Yeah. So the pump lives on, and part of, I think, what an intuition pump is meant to do is to help us find out what parts of the idea do and don't work in order to develop new questions and new approaches, right?
And that's what his life work, to me, as an appreciator, as a reader, that's what it's about. Think. It's like Winnie the Pooh. Think. Except really do it.
Right. And it goes back to what he was talking about with belief in belief, right? When you gave us that quote about him saying, retracting M equals MC square as being true, right?
Right.
That is the benefit of being a monist physicalist, right? Is that you don't owe allegiance to any idea, right? Your allegiance is to finding the truth as empirical knowledge presents it to you. So, no, I don't think he would ever have any problem with any of his ideas being critiqued or proven wrong or whatever, because he was after knowledge, right? He wasn't defending some kind of legacy of ideas he had. He was out to try to find the truth.
There's a thing that happened that I saw a news story this morning. A reporter talking to a woman who was flagrantly MAGA, okay, and she was trying to tell him, you need to go and try to look up the word journalism because you're not doing journalism because you don't present facts. And I thought of Dennett because the young man bears up and he says, well, what are facts? Are facts important? Yes, she says, and very snarkily she said, READ. And he said, right, and why then do you say that constitutionality is all about God? And she looked at him and she was angry. And he said, because the Constitution is full of God. And he said, the Constitution does not have the word God in it at all. First, she looked like she was going to burst. Then she pulled her phone out and she started reading. And she went from apoplectic to quiet. And she walked away reading it because she was finding the truth of the statement. Dennett says, if you can approach the world's complexities, both its glories and its horrors, with an attitude of humble curiosity, acknowledging that however deeply you have seen, you have only just scratched the surface, you will find worlds within worlds, beauties you could not heretofore imagine, and your own mundane preoccupations will shrink to proper size. Not all that important in the greater scheme of things. To me, that interchange was the best that humanity can manage. Because that person, no matter how livid, how absolutely certain, the certainty went away when she found out the real fact.
Yeah, and that's Definiet is a great example of it. And we've only scratched the surface of Dennett's ideas here. We could do an entire other podcast that focuses on free will and deep cities and all kinds of other things. And I'm sure that we could and we will, and probably some of the things that we've talked about here today will become their own episodes at some point in the future. So until next time, keep pondering.